Paul Conroy wakes up to find himself buried alive inside a coffin. Bound and gagged, he screams for help and tries to force the lid open, but fails. He then sees a nail protruding from the coffin lid and uses it successfully to cut the rope to free his hands. He calms down and tries to figure out the situation, but there is nothing he can do. Suddenly, a phone buzzes nearby due to an incoming call. He uses his feet to retrieve it and finds a BlackBerry phone. However, he struggles to navigate the phone because the interface is in Arabic language. He then tries to dial the safety number given by his company, but realizes he doesn't have it, because all his other belongings have been stolen. All he has is a liquor flask, anxiety medication, a Zippo lighter, and a pen. So he calls emergency services, and he tries to explain his situation to the operator. Paul is an American citizen, and he is working in Iraq as a truck driver for a company named CRT. He explains that his convoy was ambushed by Iraqi terrorists, and begs the operator to send help. When the operator realizes Paul is calling from Iraq, she is shocked, because he has reached an emergency dispatch center in Youngstown, Ohio. She then offers to transfer his call to the local sheriff's department, but Paul immediately hangs up, because he knows that they can't help him. Paul checks the phone and sees that it has about half its battery life remaining. He then calls his home in the United States, but reaches the answering machine. So he leaves a message for his wife, Linda, urging her to contact the National Guard or the Pentagon right away. He also tries her cell phone, but it goes straight to voicemail, so he leaves another message, explaining that he is buried in a coffin, and asks her to call back immediately. After a short while, he calls directory assistance to obtain the FBI's phone number. He grabs his pen and writes down the number on the coffin lid. He then dials the number and reaches a special agent named Harris. As Harris asks Paul to explain his situation in detail, the full story is revealed. Paul and a convoy of fellow drivers were delivering kitchen supplies to a community center. On the way, some local children began throwing rocks at the trucks, and then an explosive went off ahead, blowing up one of the other trucks. After that, a group of people came from behind a house and started shooting everyone on the street. Paul explains that he was at the back of the convoy when something struck him in the head. He passed out, and that was the last thing he remembered before waking up bound inside the coffin. Harris then begins asking tedious questions, such as, what the children were doing, why the attackers did not kill him, and what his social security number is. Paul grows frustrated by the interrogation, but suddenly, the phone loses its signal and the call disconnects. He begins to shift around the cramped space to search for a signal, and eventually catches a weak connection in one corner of the coffin. Now, Paul calls a customer service representative at CRT Company to report his situation. After hearing his story, the operator redirects his call to the company's director, Alan Davenport. However, Paul reaches an answering machine instead. He attempts to leave a message, explaining his situation and pleading for immediate help. But he hits the time limit, and the call cuts off, so Paul gets really frustrated. After some time, he remembers about the earlier incoming call, and immediately checks the phone. He writes down that number on the coffin lid, hoping it might help him. He then dials the number, and an Iraqi terrorist answers his call, the very person who buried him alive. The kidnapper demands $5 million by 9 p.m., and threatens to leave Paul in the coffin to die if the ransom is not met. Paul tells the kidnapper that he is just a truck driver and does not have that kind of money. So the kidnapper suggests he call the embassy to secure the funds and hangs up the phone. Paul loses all hope and crosses out the number on the coffin lid that he had hoped would save him. After some time, Paul calls directory assistance to obtain the number for Donna Mitchell, a friend of his wife. After getting the number, Paul calls Donna, but reaches an answering machine instead. As he begins to explain his situation to the voicemail, Donna picks up the call. Paul asks her to look up the State Department's number on her computer, but Donna says that she cannot do it because she is heading to the supermarket. Frustrated, Paul begins to yell at her to look up the number, so Donna gets angry and hangs up the phone. Paul then calms himself down, calls Donna again, and politely asks her to look up the number, explaining that his life is in danger. Upon realizing the severity of his situation, Donna looks up the number and gives it to Paul. Paul writes down the number on the coffin lid and hangs up the phone. Paul then dials the State Department's number, and his call is redirected to an officer named Rebecca Browning. Rebecca explains that they are already aware of his situation, because a CRT representative had contacted them after receiving his voicemail. Paul tells Rebecca that the kidnapper wants $5 million and asks if the government will pay it. However, Rebecca explains that they cannot comply, as it is against United States government policy to negotiate with terrorists. She then gives him the number for Dan Brenner, who is the commander of the hostage working group in Iraq. Hearing this, Paul realizes that the government is not going to do anything to rescue him, and threatens to contact the news media. Rebecca manages to convince Paul not to do so, and transfers his call directly to Dan Brenner. Dan tells Paul that they are already working to locate him, and suggests that he save the phone's battery life. At that exact moment, the kidnapper calls Paul. Paul informs the kidnapper that the government has refused to pay the ransom, and begs to be let go. Hearing this, the kidnapper reduces the ransom amount to $1 million, and orders Paul to make a ransom video. He also asks Paul to read a note that is placed near his foot, and hangs up the phone. Paul spots a small bag near his feet, and he tries to retrieve it, but fails. To reach it, he forcefully contorts his body inside the cramped coffin. Inside the bag, he finds 2 glow sticks, a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a ransom note. He then calls Dan, and provides the kidnapper's phone number to see if they can track the signal. Paul also asks Dan if they can trace his cell phone signal, but Dan explains that they are unable to do so, because Paul's phone appears to be an EDS line, and it is likely running through an Egyptian carrier. Paul then informs Dan that the kidnapper wants him to film a ransom video, but Dan advises him against making any video, explaining that it will severely complicate rescue efforts if the footage leaks to the media. After that, Paul asks Dan if his team has rescued anyone before. Dan stays quiet for a while, and replies, "Not many." Paul then demands the names of those rescued people, so Dan tells him about a young man named Mark White, who was rescued from a similar situation 3 weeks prior, and he is now home safe with his family. Hearing this, Paul begins to feel a glimmer of hope, and Dan encourages him to stay strong. Shortly after, the kidnapper calls Paul back, and continues yelling at him to make the ransom video. Paul gets frustrated, and he hangs up the phone. He now pulls out his anxiety pills and a liquor flask, then takes a pill and a swig of liquor to calm his nerves. Afterward, he calls a hospital to speak with his mother. Because his mother suffers from dementia, she does not remember him, and the conversation does not go well. Thinking this could be their last conversation, Paul says his final goodbye to his mother and ends the call. He then breaks down in tears, and at that exact moment, he receives a message on his phone. He checks it, and sees a picture of his coworker, Pamela, being held hostage by the same kidnapper. He immediately calls the kidnapper back, and begs him not to harm Pamela, promising that he will make the ransom video. Paul then quickly reads the note, records the ransom video using the phone's camera, and sends it to the kidnapper. He is now exhausted by the grueling ordeal, and soon, he falls asleep. After a while, he wakes up upon noticing something crawling inside his clothes, and slowly, a snake crawls out of his pants. The snake settles in the corner of the coffin, so Paul takes out his liquor flask, and he sprinkles alcohol toward the snake. He then pulls out his lighter, and ignites it. At that exact moment, the phone vibrates with an incoming call, but he is unable to answer due to the chaotic struggle with the fire and the snake. Meanwhile, the flame panics the snake, so it quickly slithers out through a small hole in the wood. Once the snake is gone, Paul quickly plugs the hole with a piece of cloth. In the process, he knocks over the liquor flask, and the spilling alcohol begins to spread toward the flame. Seeing this, Paul quickly contorts his body inside the cramped coffin once again, and he manages to put out the fire. After some time, he fiddles with the phone, and successfully manages to change the language to English. He then finds his cell phone number, and immediately leaves a voice message for his wife to call him back at that number. Shortly afterward, Paul receives a video message. He opens it, and sees a recording of Pamela, who frantically explains that her video plea has gone unanswered. Before she can say more, kidnapper shots her in the head. Horrified by the video, Paul completely loses hope, and he even tries to commit suicide by slitting his throat, though he manages to stop himself. Sometime later, Dan calls Paul, and informs him that the kidnapper has leaked his ransom video on YouTube. Paul now believes that there is no hope of rescue, and Dan is only calling to comfort him until he dies in the coffin. However, Dan encourages him not to lose hope, and reveals that they have a solid lead on his whereabouts. At that exact moment, F-16 fighter jets begin bombing on the surface above. The violent shockwaves fracture the coffin's lid, and sands begin to pour inside. Paul quickly tries to patch the fracture with a piece of cloth, and right then, he receives a call from the director of the CRT company, Alan Davenport. Once Paul manages to patch the fracture in the coffin's lid, Alan begins asking some questions about his situation. Alan then informs Paul that their conversation will be recorded, and begins asking highly formal questions about his employment. Paul is puzzled by the sudden formality, and soon, Alan reveals that they have found out about his prohibited physical relationship with his coworker, Pamela. Because of this policy violation, Alan states that Paul has been terminated from his job, so he and his family will not be entitled to any company's benefits or pensions. Hearing this, Paul realizes that Alan is recording their conversation as a legal proof of termination, so that the CRT company can walk away from the situation without providing any financial liability or rescue assistance. After obtaining what he needs, Alan apologizes, and hangs up the phone, leaving Paul in complete disbelief. Sometime later, Paul checks the phone, and sees its battery clinging to its last bar. He attempts to call his wife one last time, but receives no response. Suddenly, the makeshift patch on the coffin lid fails, and sand begins to pour inside. Paul tries to patch it back, but realizes that he can't stop the sand from falling anymore. Shortly after, Dan calls Paul. He reveals that the kidnappers might have been killed in the earlier F-16 bombing, and now there is no way to track his location. Feeling defeated, Dan apologizes for failing to save him. Paul also realizes that he is destined to die inside the coffin, so he quietly hangs up the phone. With no hope left, Paul records his last testament as a video message. He leaves the $700 in his personal savings to his wife Linda. But because he has nothing of value to pass down to his son, he leaves him his clothes, telling him that they will fit him once he grows up. Paul then apologizes to Linda, saying he should have listened to her and never should have come to Iraq. With that, he ends the recording, and places the Zippo on his chest, waiting for death as the lighter's flame slowly fades out. However, shortly after, the kidnapper calls Paul demanding the ransom. Paul replies that there is no money, and he is going to die due to the sand pouring inside the coffin. The kidnapper doesn't care, and demands that he make a video of himself cutting off his finger, otherwise, they will kill his family in the US. Paul thinks that the kidnapper is bluffing, but the kidnapper terrifies him by revealing the exact location of his house back home. Paul then immediately calls his wife, and he leaves a frantic voicemail warning her to stay away from the house and to seek protection from the sheriff's department. He then leaves a voice message for Dan, alerting him that the kidnapper is still alive. Looking at Pamela's execution video, Paul fears for his family's safety, so he decides to make the video. He takes out the pocket knife, records himself cutting off his finger, and sends the video to the kidnapper. As the sand begins to fill the coffin, Paul waits for his end. Shortly after, Dan calls him, revealing that one of the terrorists they captured has provided the details of where to find a man who was buried alive, and they are on their way to rescue him. Hearing this, Paul starts to have new glimmer of hope, even though the sand is on the verge of filling the coffin completely. Just then, he gets a call from his wife Linda. She explains that she had accidentally left her phone at home while at work, and begs him to come home safely. Paul assures Linda that he is going to be okay, and hangs up the phone to speak with Dan. Dan reveals that his team is at the burial site, and they are digging to get him out of the coffin. Over the phone, the sound of frantic digging echoes, but Paul does not hear any digging around him. Soon, Dan's team digs up a coffin and opens it, but it is revealed with great shock that the terrorist has led them to Mark White's coffin. Paul instantly realizes that Mark was never rescued, and that Dan's team has never saved anyone before. As the sand finally fills the coffin, Paul accepts his grim fate and suffocates to his death. In the background, Dan profusely apologizes to Paul, and the movie ends. So that was the movie, Buried. It is a survival thriller film released in 2010. Do you guys think that an incident like this has actually happened in real life? Comment your thoughts below, and remember to subscribe to the channel for more movie breaks.